Good evening, good morning, YouTube. Salutations. So I just recently read the first four Sharpe novels by Bernard Cornwell and his Richard Sharpe series, and I want to talk about it on the channel. If you're not familiar with Bernard Cornwell, he's most well known for two different series. So the first one is The Last Kingdom, or the Saxon Stories. Most people will probably know it as The Last Kingdom from the TV show, which is set during Viking Age England. And then the other one is the Richard Sharpe series, which is set during the Napoleonic era. So I have read the first four in publication order, so there's a little bit of convolution with the Sharpe series. It's actually something I like about it. But so Bernard Cornwell, the Richard Sharpe series has 24 books in it. The original series had eight or nine, and his first 8 or 9, they weren't, well, almost in chronological order. So he actually wrote the first 6 in chronological order, and when the Richard Sharpe book series got picked up as a TV show, they asked him to make one more book that was set prior to make a prequel book basically, and that's Sharpe's Rifles, which is a pretty well-known book. It's also the name of the very first episode of the TV series, I'm fairly certain. And when I say TV series, that's kind of a loose definition of it because it's really TV movies, and they would make 1 to 2 for basically all throughout the 90s, and they made a couple even after that. So anyway, so the Sharpe's Rifles was the very first one made out of chronological order, although Bernard Cornwell would go on to do that more all throughout the rest of time, basically up until the modern day. So, but the first 8 or 9 books lead up to Waterloo. If you're not familiar with the Napoleonic era, that's where Napoleon loses. He's defeated by the Duke of Wellington. The Sharpe series is absolutely fantastic if you've never read it. There's no, internal wisdom in them. They're not going to make you really smart or anything, but they're really fun. They're really fun action-adventure stories. For me, at least in my personal experience, it led to me learning a lot about history. So if you've watched any of my videos, Bernard Cornwell is my favorite author. He's always going to be my favorite author. And I'm going to be the foremost authority on the internet about Bernard Cornwell. Anyway, sorry, I'm just joking. But I am going to reread his whole catalog. So anyway, just a review of these, so a little bit of a breakdown. So Bernard Cornwell, whenever he writes these Sharpe novels, and really any of his novels, he puts historical notes in the back. Most of his novels are always based on some historical event, and it can be a few different things. Typically, it tends to be battles, since these are largely military fiction. It tends to revolve around battles, but sometimes it's some other stuff like reconnaissance missions and stuff. I'll get into that a little bit because there's a good one here in these first 4 that is kind of like that. Anyway, the historical notes, he always talks about what actually happened in the events. He always, not always, but often puts maps in the books too, and what he changed. So he will change things, and he admits it that, in the real world, one soldier like this is not going to be involved in this immediate event. So he sort of stretches the suspension of belief, but I think it's great. I think it really works. And if you read these books, it might remind you a lot of Indiana Jones, and it's fun. It's kind of ironic because the TV series drastically changed one of the books for the TV show, and they made it a lot like Indiana Jones. I don't know if they did that on purpose, but it's funny because I had crossed my mind before, and just recently I've been doing some research on the TV series, and I didn't realize how popular it was. And it's Sharpe's Gold they changed a lot, and they gave it this really Indiana Jones feel to it for some reason. Anyway, Indiana Jones is great too, though. So, but I'm just going to briefly talk about the books, a little bit about Bernard Cornwell. If you don't know who Bernard Cornwell, the author, is, hold on, I have some good quotes here too. Not quotes, but some excerpts. So I'll read these here in a little bit. I guess I could have pulled a couple of these off the shelf too, if you guys want to see the covers. I got them right here. Because these are 2 of the ones I read. Yeah, these 2. But I've read 4. Sorry, my dog might start barking, so I apologize for that. Of course, these are both the sketch covers. So I've never cared for these sketch covers a lot, personally. Some of them are okay. That's a pretty good one. Yeah, that's pretty good. Yeah, there's another group of covers for these books that are like memorabilia from the age, and I really like those a lot. No. Sorry. I guess I should have just read these excerpts while I had them up. So now it's not going to come up. But anyway, having technical difficulties. Give me one moment here. see if I can pull this back up real fast. Yep, okay, they're right there. So, anyway, I really enjoy these books a lot. And, and for me, these books, like I've been reading Bernard Cornwell for a long time. And so there's a nostalgia element for me. And and these are like going home for me. So I remember being a young man, moving back to my grandma's house and reading these, and just in a time of my life where there wasn't much joy, I found great joy in these, and these were an escape for me. So they're always going to be that for me. That can't be replaced. So I'll admit there's some bias here, but I read these first four, and I just had a blast. I had a really good time. Like I said, it's like going home for me. But it doesn't matter. I love these characters. I love Richard Sharpe. I love Sergeant Harper. Hogan. I love these characters, and it's a really good time. Sharpe's Gold, the second one in publication order, that's the one that made me fall in love with the series originally. So I read Westerns before I started reading these, and I was looking for something similar, and I remember reading Sharpe's Gold. The plot of Sharpe's Gold is that Richard Sharpe has to go and get this gold for the Duke of Wellington, and sorry, let me adjust the camera just a little bit there. Okay. And there's like some gold that's hidden in the mountains, and just to give you a brief, if you don't know that much about the Napoleonic era, there's a group called the Partisans that are Spanish, and they are fighting a guerrilla war referred to as the Little War, which is where our modern day term guerrilla warfare comes from. So, and these Spanish fighters are out in the hills fighting, even though the Spanish government has collapsed and the Spanish army has collapsed, basically. There's still bands of soldiers fighting for the Spanish cause. So it's some Spaniards, Spaniard partisans that have this gold, and they have their own allegiances and their own motivations. And the guy who has the gold wants to keep it, so he's not really fighting for Spain the way he should be. And this happens a lot throughout these books. It's a very complicated affair. But anyway, they go and they get the gold. And there's basically a standoff. So as a young man who liked Westerns and then going and reading this book, it really appealed to me, and I really enjoyed it a lot. Again, these aren't like fantastic. These aren't going to be like, they're not high literature. They're not really, Bernard Cornwell's not really like that. They're action adventure. They're a lot of fun. But saying that, I'm going to read a couple excerpts from these books. This first one, these are all from Sharpe's Sword, which was the fourth one. But I'm going to read these excerpts and see if you tell me if Bernard Cornwell is not a good writer. So here's one. This was at the end. So in Sharpe's Sword, which was probably, every time I read one, I kept thinking, oh, this is my favorite. This is my favorite. This is my favorite. So of like that group of books. So they were all very good. Sharpe's Sword, there's some spy game stuff in Sharpe's Sword, which involves, she's a Spanish woman. No, she's French, because she's the sister of the main villain in Sharpe's Sword, who's LaRue, who's known for torturing people and is just kind of a spy master. So anyway, his sister is posing as basically somebody else in the city, that's a fortress that the British take in the very beginning, and she's pretending like she's this spy, the Mirador. Well, El Mirador, I'm sorry. It's a masculine word. Anyway, and so Sharpe and her end up getting together, and she's trying to get information from Sharpe, and he doesn't realize that she's a spy at first. And eventually he does counterintelligence, or basically feeds her false information so that she goes and gives it to the French army, which ends up leading to a victory for the British. But anyway, at the end of that, after he finds all that stuff out, this is something that's said at the end there. He said he thought to himself he had nothing of hers to remember her by, only memory, which was the worst souvenir. That's pretty elegant. So here's another one. This is what he said to Hogan. Hogan is an engineer in the British Army. He's an Irishman, really smart guy. He's a friend of Sharpe's. And I think at this point, Hogan had just said, well, maybe you'll get some money or something. You'll get rewarded for something. And Sharpe shrugged. I get rainbow, sir, never the pots of gold. Which is kind of ironic because he's speaking to an Irishman, right? There's another scene. So there's another character in Sharpe's Sword that's Lord Spears. He's of nobility. He's been in the same city with the spy lady. And there's another spy whose name is Curtis. He's actually priest, and he's the actual spy master for Britain. It's been given the British Army all this information. But anyway, Lord Spears he's gambled away his family's fortune, and he was injured for a while, and he's just a bit of a scallywag, you might describe him. Kind of like a Flashman if you know Flashman. But so he's just not a very good person, but he's kind of a nice guy though, and Sharpe likes him until the end. But once he realizes that he's a turncoat and that he's been hurting the British Army, that Sharpe doesn't like him too much then. But he does end up helping him. But anyway, when Sharpe he finds him at a battle at the very end, and he's mortally wounded, and he comes clean to Sharpe and tells Sharpe all this stuff, and Sharpe ends up getting some information out of him, and then tries to do him a service and executes him because he is going to die. And he admits that he has syphilis and all this other stuff. So, but anyway, so when he's talking to Hogan, wanted him back, wanted Lord Spears back for what I think he wanted some information from him. Although Hogan doesn't know that he was a spy. So he says, this is what Hogan says to Sharpe, and remember I said Sharpe executed him. He said, and he's asking him about Lord Spears. He says, I hear his body was some way from all the others. Some way from the fighting, in fact. Odd, Sharpe shook his head. He could have crawled away, sir. Yes, with a hole in his head. I'm sure you're right, Richard. Obviously, the implication being, how did he crawl so, if he died fighting, how did he crawl so far away with a hole in his head? Anyway, I think these books are just a ton of fun. And like I said, Sharpe's sword just had, there's all this spy gang stuff in it. There's one more excerpt I'm going to read because that's about Sharpe's sword. So Sharpe's sword breaks early on. Richard Sharpe carries a heavy cavalry sword, and he's an infantryman. He rides horses, but very rarely. It's a very large sword. It's a 35 or 36 inch blade, and these heavy cavalry swords are quite thick, so they actually work pretty well to bludgeon with as well. It has a handguard, and he uses the sword all the time, but the sword breaks. During Sharpe's sword, Richard Sharpe is gravely injured, and one of the things I really like about these books is I think Bernard Cornwell does a really fantastic job of depicting what it was like, and he does not in this time in these eras of history and these battles, and he does not sugarcoat it. He shows just how miserable existence would be at this time. So Sharpe is mortally wounded, not mortally wounded, but is gravely wounded at some point in time, gut shot, but it must not, they couldn't find an exit wound, but the bullet must have either gone through or just chunked him out, because obviously if the bullet was stuck in him, he wouldn't have lived. And he ends up down in like these like a building where they put all the people they know are going to die, they put him down there. Luckily they sewed him up at least, and he does end up living, but it's just miserable in this it's like underground. It's just a miserable place with all these people. Obviously medicinal practices and hygiene were not good at this time. So anyway, but during that time, his sword had broken earlier. There's a fantastic fight scene in this book in the hallway. It's between Sharpe and LaRue, and Harper's involved in it. LaRue gets the jump on him, so he ends up getting away. But that's when Sharpe is gravely injured, and Sergeant Harper is hurt really badly too. Sergeant Harper is like Richard Sharpe's best friend. So anyway, while Sharpe is recovering, Harper gets him a new sword and reworks this sword for him to make it like the one he just had. There's actually an interview of Bernard Cornwell talking about these swords. So they actually were rounded at the top, I don't really know how to describe it, almost like a half moon shape. But the guys on the field would actually regrind them and point them, right, to give them a steeple edge like this, so that way you can jab with it better. So anyway, this is but another excerpt from the book. He said, the sword at his side, the sword that Harper had given him was crude and ill-balanced. It was too long for an infantryman. It was clumsy, and it was stamped out with hundreds more in an ill-lit Birmingham factory. Beside the Kilgenthal, which is the sword of LaRue, the French guy who was of nobility, had really fancy stuff. It's raw, cheap, and crude. and he kind of uses the comparisons of the two swords, like LaRue had this really fancy sword, and Sharpe had this mass-produced, clunky, really heavy sword that could be a very brutal weapon, used by a very strong person, but wasn't quite, it wasn't really meant for like the fencing and that sort of stuff. But he actually uses those two swords analogous. LaRue's this rich, fancy guy, and Richard Sharpe is, he's a bastard. He grew up in London, in the slums, in an orphanage. I guess I could have gone over some of that stuff too. And, kind of uses the comparison of the two swords is the same as LaRue and Richard Sharpe. And Richard Sharpe's my favorite character in all of fiction, and I guess I could have talked about this stuff some more too. I should have talked about it earlier in the video. So Richard Sharpe, like I just said, he's a bastard. He doesn't know his father. His mother died when he was young. He has no living family during the whole time of him being in the Peninsular War. Besides, he gets married. But anyway, twice. But besides that, he has no living family. So Richard Sharpe. He's been in the military since he was a teenager, like 15, 16 years old, because there was nothing else he could do, and he didn't want to starve. So he fights in India. He actually starts during the War of the First Coalition, which takes place in Flanders, which modern-day Netherlands and stuff. Well, Flanders, Belgium. So anyway, in that area, Belgium, Netherlands, the War of the First Coalition's right there. So anyway. So that's where he first fights, and then he goes to India, and he fights in India too. And then now he's come back to the Peninsular War. There are actually 3 Sharpe novels set in India, and those are 3 of my absolute favorites. I used to love those. And part of that's because I just didn't know that much about the British fighting in India at the time. Obviously, I knew that India was part of the British Empire, but I just didn't know that much about it. So it was there was a lot of, at that time, there was like a lot of discovery for me and a facet of history I just didn't know that much about. But anyway, so Sharpe is given a commission as an officer, which is incredibly rare in the British Army. It's like something like less than 5% of all the officers at this time in Britain were, just normal, not nobility, or didn't get it through the purchase system, their rank or their commissions. If you don't know what the purchase system is, it's So basically, what would happen is these in the British Army, guys would purchase their own commissions for whatever rank, however much they could afford. I think there was some limitations to it, like there was some age limits to it. Like if you were, because you had to be at least like 16 or 17, and you could only purchase up to a captain until you were like over age 22, and then you could purchase a little bit, another higher rank above cap, which is like. I can't remember all the British ranks off the top of my head. And I think because it's ensign, lieutenant, captain, and then it goes to colonel. It's not colonel. It's like lieutenant something. But anyway, lieutenant major I think is next, and then major, and then there's only so many you can purchase though. Like the very, very high ranks, you cannot purchase those. So those are only by promotion once you get there. And obviously, there was a lot of negatives to this, and Bernard Cornwell shows the negatives because obviously very incompetent people, if they just have money, can buy into it. But it did also work too, right? Because if you have the money to be able to buy into an officer's commission, you're going to be pretty well educated. You're going to speak French for sure, because it was just common at that time in England. Still is to this day. They teach a lot of French is taught in schools, and you're probably going to speak German and Spanish too. So. Especially at that time in history, that was just part of education at that time, was learning foreign languages. I don't know why they got away from that in schools, because I see a foreign language as a skill, and I think the modern school system would do better to kind of go back more towards that, but that's just my opinion. So anyway, we don't have to get into all that, maybe in a future video. But there were some benefits to it too, like I said, obviously if you could afford that, then you probably had a previous training, which was common. I think if you went through some of their military schools, you could buy up higher in the commission system and the ranks if you had gone to the school, but you didn't have to do that. It wasn't mandatory. So, and then it kind of worked as a way for because they didn't pay the officers all that much more than any other ranks. I mean, you did get a raise that you did make more money than a private or a sergeant, but it's not like it paid super great. But besides that. It might have paid decent while you were in there, but there was no, pension or retirement. So when you were done, and you didn't want to do it anymore, you could sell your commission to somebody else, and you'd get that money, and you probably would make money on it just during that time. And obviously, depending on where you were at, if you were in a good, you know, if you were stationed in England or Scotland or Ireland, like those are really desirable spots, and guys would pay extra money to get those. So there were set prices, but people, you know, kind of did underhand dealings and stuff to get more money out of it. So it's really interesting. The history chap has a whole video on the purchase system. If you're in the British Army, if you're interested in that subject, it is really interesting. I kind of find just the British Empire in general to be very interesting. See, I got some other notes here. There are a lot of themes all throughout all four of these books about friendship and honor are really big ones. I mentioned Sean Bean. I mentioned the purchase system. I talked about Sergeant Harper is an Irishman. So, and it's a bit, you know, there's a bit of irony to it because Ireland had some uprisings and tried to rebel, and it just did not go well. So, but now Sergeant Harper, he always says, you know, I'm fighting for the enemy. So, but him and Sharpe become good friends. And if you read Sharpe's Rifles, they actually kind of started off on the wrong foot. Bernard Cornwell is really good at depicting friendship and kind of like the band of brothers and these guys fighting for each other if they can't always fight for the country. It's just, like I said, these are just a ton of fun, man. It's I just really enjoy them. And I tell you what, before I read this series, I didn't really understand the Spanish guerrillas or the partisans and how that worked. And you can just see all the you know, it's like a diamond, all the facets to it and how complex it really was. There's another scene. It's in Sharpe's. It's the third one I read, which was did I write it down? I think that's Sharpe's sword, Sharpe's gold. Sharpe's eagle is the first one, which he captures an eagle. It's okay. Sharpe's company is the third one. They assault a fort in that one, both by escalade and breach. So there's only a handful of ways to assault a fort. I mentioned this in a previous video I did on a Sharpe book. When you escalade on a fort, these walls, the one they're attacking the second fort they take, are 50 feet high. Guys would run up with a ladder that high and set it against the wall and climb up it. So you can just imagine the amount of death that happened and how miserable of an experience that would be. And, you know, obviously if you're climbing up a ladder, you don't know what's happening above you. So, you know, they can shoot down on you, they can pour hot water on you, they can throw stones at you. But anyway, a breach is even worse. That's just where they try to blow away part of the wall and try to make it through, right? And that's still a small crevice. You know, they try to stack stuff up, wooden objects to climb up and get over the wall. And Sharpe's company, Sharpe loses. So he's gazetted as a captain at some point by the Duke of Wellington. I'll talk about the Duke of Wellington a little bit here in just a second too, because I really like the way Bernard Cornwell depicts the Duke of Wellington. So they have what's called the Forlorn Hope, and guys volunteer basically to be the first people to try to go into the breach. And Sharpe volunteers because he lost his gazette, you know, his rank. That he didn't lose it; it was refused. It's just the way the British Army works. At one point in time, the Duke of Wellington basically gives what they call a gazette and gives Sharpe some extra rank and makes him captain. And it sits in London for like 2.5 years. They misplaced it, and so they never approved it. And when he reminds them, they ended up declining him anyway, even though he'd won an eagle and done all kinds of brave stuff. But something else, I said I'll go ahead and end the video soon because it's getting pretty long. Something else I really like about these books is the way Bernard Cornwell portrays the Duke of Wellington. The historical fiction genre is usually, there's like two main ways of doing it. You either make the book about the main historical figures, or you make it about a fictional character that you made up, and that character kind of goes through these events. Maybe we'll know the key historical figures. Usually it's something like that. There's some other ways to do historical fiction, but those are like the two main ways. Bernard Cornwell does the second way, right? And then Bernard Cornwell describes it as the big story and the little story. Of course, in the Sharpe series, the big story is the peninsular invasion by the British and the march to Paris, and the little story is the stuff Sharpe goes through. But anyway, so the way I just like the way Bernard Cornwell, you can tell, is just a massive fan of the Duke of Wellington. Anytime he talks about him, the Duke of Wellington is one of the, if you don't know who that is, he's one of the most famous military commanders in British history. Just had an outstanding success. I feel like he never lost a battle, but maybe he lost one. I feel like he didn't though. It's him and the Duke of Marlborough are probably the two most famous military commanders ever for the British Army, at least during the time of the Empire. So anyway, the way he portrays the Duke of Wellington is, he kind of builds him up. He makes him this epic character, this epic person, and he's a little bit short. He doesn't really like certain kinds of conversations and stuff. Kind of like almost like the Charlie Brown parents, right? Like you never really get to see him, but you do a little bit. Sharpe has some dialogue with him. Sharpe actually saved the Duke of Wellington's life. That's how he got his original commission. So because Sharpe fought in India, the Duke of Wellington also was obviously a commander, and that's real history. He was a general in India. He won the Battle of Versailles, which is one of the most famous battles in British history, and it was against overwhelming odds. And Sharpe saves Wellington's life during that battle, and Wellington gives him a commission, and he also gifts him a telescope that has some initials and stuff engraved on it. And so Wellington tries to look out for Sharpe. Besides Sharpe just being a good soldier, he kind of doesn't like Sharpe as a person because he's not, nobility. Like he, sees him as a rogue and kind of a rough customer, but he knows he needs guys like that, during the war. So anyway, I highly recommend these books. Like I said, and if this doesn't, and this should tell you anything, I read 4 of them in a row. I was going to work something else in, and I was just having such a great time reading these Sharpe books. And even though I couldn't get access to the 5th one in publication order, I just decided to go and read Sharpe's Rifle since I own that. Like I said, it didn't really matter because Sharpe's Rifle is a prequel. It wasn't written in the right order anyway, so I just decided I'll go and read that. And then hopefully the 5th one will be available at the library by the time I get done with it. Because I was just having such a good time, and I want to keep reading these books. So that makes just 6 Sharpe novels I've read in the month of December alone. So, I'm going to read a 7th one because it won't take me long to finish Sharpe's Rifles. But I highly recommend these. Like I said, I'm biased, but I'm not going to give a rating to each individual one, but I would say all 4 of them I would give, a 9 out of 10. And I hope those excerpts I read were enough to show you that Bernard Cornwell is a talented writer. Bernard Cornwell didn't really start writing books until he was almost 40. He worked for the BBC, the television channel, prior to that. And if you watch any interviews, he talks about this all the time, but he didn't work in like drama television. He worked in news and current events, and he was a writer for them. So he always says that he was never afraid of a blank page because his deadlines were so tight. But at that time, he would sometimes have to write things in 24 to 48 hours. So he said that never really bothered him. There's a lot of interesting stuff about Bernard Cornwell. He never made outlines. He said he would sometimes get down to the last 1 or 2 chapters of the book and not know how it was going to end. But, anyway, he comes to the United States because of his wife. His wife can't stay in the UK, and that's when he writes his first Sharpe novel because he can't get a green card at first when he's in the US. He needed to make money somehow, so imagine that, huh? But anyway, he seems like a really genuinely nice guy from what I've seen. I've watched quite a few interviews about Bernard Cornwell. It's one thing interesting about our modern world is just that how much access we have to these people, and we get to see so much about them and know so much about their lives. I've seen the inside of his house. So if you see his garden, he's got like a replica cannon out there. I think it's like it looks like a 12-pounder cannon from what I saw, but I might be wrong. But it's in his garden, and it's pretty cool. But anyway, he's also got a replica. It's an actual sword. It's not a replica. It's a real sword that was from Waterloo. So it's a heavy cavalry sword, just like Richard Sharpe's. It seems like he does a lot. He did a lot of research on all this, and he said he was already a fan of the Napoleonic era, and interested in that time period long before he started writing the series. He cites Horatio Hornblower, the C.S. Forester books, as being a big inspiration for him, and I can see that. So, but anyway, definitely check these out. They're a really good time. I promise you won't be disappointed. These are a ton of fun, and I read all 4 of these in less than a week. So that should tell you something. I read Sharpe's Gold in one day, and at the time I was like, "Oh man, this one's fantastic. This is going to be my favorite for a while." And I ended up liking Sharpe's Company more, and then I ended up liking Sharpe's Sword even more. It's interesting to see the progression of Cornwell too. All of them were good, but by the time you get to Sharpe's Company and Sharpe's Sword, like he's really starting to like get the hang of it. They're just a ton of fun, man. They're good books. They really are. They're really enjoyable. So, anyway, that's all for today, YouTube. Good night or good day, wherever you're at.